Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Mara. I am in for Rachel this morning, but there are still some faces I recognize. It's wonderful to see you. If you're new here, welcome. You are in for a treat to learn from Dr. Sara Ronis, excuse me. I will soon turn it over to her. We have a source sheet that I will be sharing in the chat, and feel free to continue saying where you're from. And we're gonna dive back into Bava Metzia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mara. Good morning, everyone. It is lovely to see you all. And a special shout out to those who are joining us from, it looks like from a couple of folks, places where it might be rather later than I am comfortable with. So welcome from wherever you are in the world. This week was chock full of financial discussions. So we started out by talking about the nature of court penalties for charging interest. We asked a question of whether we can offer a discount if someone signs a lease for a year instead of a month-to-month lease. Though, funny enough, the Talmud thinks that the standard month-to-month lease is that you pay the rental fee at the end of the year and not the first of the month. As someone who rented for many years, that sort of charmed me. We saw a number of cases where rabbis described their own practices of charging tacit interest and the Talmud's discussion of whether each of those different strategies is actually permitted. We looked at the financial arrangements permitted when selling a field to someone who doesn't have all the money now, and the laws of collateral when the collateral is worth more than the loan. We asked a question about whether you can add negative conditions to a sale and have it still affect acquisition. We discussed the laws of financial exploitation yet again. We asked how a person can benefit from mortgaged property. We understood the importance of local norms when buying and selling. And we discussed when those local norms have halachic force, right? They have legal force, and actually when they don't, when, sorry, that's your local norm, but the rabbis say it's wrong. We discussed how to enter into an unequal business partnership. Here, talking mostly about agriculture and animal husbandry. And then we ended the week talking about how all of that related to when the money or property is being held for orphans. So lots of very rich financial discussions are happening. Now, what I want to do today is actually something that we don't usually do, but I'm going to do it anyways, which is I want to return to a piece of text that those of you who are reading our newsletter have already read about. So this is on Baba Metzia 66a. And Rabbi Lexi Botzum wrote about this exact story. And I thought her piece was wonderful. This is not a, oh no, I think someone did it wrong, so I want to do it differently. This is, actually, I thought Rabbi Botzum's piece was wonderful. And there was more to say about it that could be said in one of those short newsletter pieces. So we're going to return to a piece that those of you who are reading the newsletters should be semi-familiar with. And Mara, as folks do it come in, feel free to share the piece again. And I see some folks have already joined the handout. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to switch to the handout. You can just look along with me, or you can follow along yourself. This is totally learner's choice. So because we already discussed part of the story in depth, I will just summarize some of the beginning of the story. So we start out with a dispute between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Rav Huna says that if you are lending somebody a field, let's say, and you try to add conditions to the lending, Rav Huna says, if you state your condition before you lend the field, great, it's effective. If, however, you state your condition once the field is lent, right? So you've lent the field to someone, and then you say, oh, and by the way, here's this condition. Rav Huna says, well, then it doesn't, you can't retroactively state a condition. Once you've lent the field, you can no longer add more conditions. And Rav Nachman says, no, you can. The lender, even after the lender has stated his condition, he can the condition is effective. Okay, and I know this stuff is complicated, so if folks are lost, please feel free to, I've pulled the chat up and I'll try to keep an eye on that, right? So the question right now is, once you've actually exchanged, let's say the money, can the lender add another condition? Rav Nachman says yes, and it's effective. Rav Huna says you can add whatever condition you want, but it's not effective, right? You can say anything you want, but it has no legal force in those cases. So that's the original dispute. Then we get this fascinating story, right? So Rav Nachman, and here I'll actually read. Rav Nachman performed an action in the court of the Exilarch in accordance with his statement. So just as a reminder, maybe not a reminder, maybe this is the first time we've learned this, the Exilarch is the name of the leader of the Jewish community in Babylonia. They are traditionally understood to be descended from the King David and the Davidic household. So the Exilarch is a descendant of David, and they serve as the political leader of the Jewish community and the liaison between the Jewish community and the Sasanian king. So they are wealthy, politically powerful with the Jews, and essentially the folks who liaise between the Jews and the Sasanian king. And that put them in a bit of an awkward position, because one of the things that they were, in theory, probably responsible for was collecting taxes. So they were not always beloved, but they were important. Rav Nachman, right, and apparently the Exilarch has his own court attached to his household. So he has his own Beit Din attached to his household, and Rav Nachman is ruling from that court, at least on this day. And I think for context there, it's probably worth just skipping to the next source, which I brought you from Chulin, which offers us some helpful context. Rav Nachman is the son-in-law of the family of the Exilarch. So he has married, depending on scholars debate whether he married the daughter of the Exilarch or whether he married a daughter from the household of the Exilarch, which could include an extended family. Either way, he is, right, the Yiddish term is he's got yiches. In English, he is very well networked through family ties. So apparently, he is ruling from this court in the house of the Exilarch. And Rav Nachman is an expert. He rules on financial matters in particular all the time. So he performed an action in the court of the Exilarch in accordance with his statement, right? This is his position, so he rules from something comes to him, somebody, I assume, has written a lease and then added a retroactive condition, and he says, yep, that's totally fine. The case then came before Rav Yehuda, who tore up the lender's deed. Rav Yehuda says, no, absolutely not fine, can't do that, this is invalid, throwing it up. Okay, so that's the story so far, and I think there's one other piece of this that we have to understand. And that is, and again, this is all of the stuff that, like, if we could have written, I know if we could have written 2,000 words instead of 750, all of this would be in the piece. But I think this hopefully is a nice compliment. So Rav Nachman is Rav Nachman Bar Yaakov. I will put that in the chat because there's a lot of Rav Nachman. This is Rav Nachman Bar Yaakov. And Rav Nachman Bar Yaakov is a member of the third generation of Babylonian rabbis. So he is a third generation Babylonian rabbi. Rav Yehuda, who is also a Babylonian rabbi, is a second generation Babylonian rabbi. And that means he's a lot older than Rav Nachman. And in the world of the rabbis, that often means he's a lot more senior than Rav Nachman, right? So we've got a really interesting case where it's almost like, I'm sure none of us have ever had a boss an immediate supervisor who we didn't always agree with. But I've seen on TV that sometimes when somebody doesn't agree with their immediate supervisor, they might go over his head to his supervisor's supervisor or her supervisor's supervisor. So we could imagine this person going to Rav Nachman thinking, I don't like it. Probably the borrower who's not happy with this retroactive condition, going again over his head to Rav Yehuda on this level of seniority. And Rav Yehuda says it is invalid. Yep, he couldn't have done that. Sorry, rip it up. All right. The exilarch then said to Rav Nachman, hey, Rav Yehuda tore up your document. And then we get these two different stories, these two different versions of the story about what Rav Nachman responds. Rav Nachman said to him, did a child tear it up? A great man tore it up. He must have seen some reason and tore it up, right? So version one is Rav Nachman says, oh, he's much more senior than me. He's got much more context. There must have been a reason he tore it up, so we're going to follow him in this case. There are those who say a different version of this exchange, according to which Rav Nachman said to him, a child tore it up, as everyone is like a child relative to me with regard to monetary law. Look, toddlers can throw tantrums. It doesn't have legal force. When it comes to this, I'm the expert, and too bad, right? Like if your toddler knocks over your lease and spills, I don't know, Cheerios, milky Cheerios on them, and your lease is gone, you still have to pay your rent, right? So, okay, he had a tantrum, whatever. So those are the two different responses. Now I see a question from Betsy. I'm going to answer the question, and as I answer the question, I'm going to ask you to just start. I'm about to ask you, so you can start thinking about it. What do you think of these two different accounts? So scholars think that this Rav Nachman is Rav Nachman bar Yaakov. There are two famous Rav Nachmans in the Talmud, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak and Rav Nachman bar Yaakov. And the Talmud usually, when it's talking about Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, it usually gives us his patronym. It says bar Yitzchak. The early medieval rabbis who are reading this therefore suggest that when it's not marked, when it's just Rav Nachman without a patronym, that it's Rav Nachman bar Yaakov. And that's the Rav Nachman who is connected to the house of the exilarch. So contextually, that makes more sense here because here he is in his household Beit Din, his household court, and also apparently they're having this conversation where the exilarch is like coming to him and being like, oh, you'll never guess what Rav Yehuda did. Right. So this seems to be the Rav Nachman who has the strong ties to the household of the exilarch. So what do we think of these two different accounts? Anyone want to, maybe you can raise your hand and Mara can unmute you. I'd love to get just what's your take on what we've read so far? Wherever you want to take it. Okay, so Aaron in the chat writes, I think we're seeing a power struggle between official and unofficial authority. Interesting. Well, and you know what's interesting is that it's in both cases, it's official authority. It's just political authority versus rabbinic authority. And in both cases, it's rabbis and rabbinic authority that that one of them is a rabbi who has rabbinic authority, and it has sort of the house of the exilarch behind him, right? So it's rabbi versus rabbi, plus add in one of them has much more political clout. So I'm seeing, and again, if folks want to unmute, if folks want to raise their hand, we will unmute you and you can say it out loud to the class. Otherwise, I'm happy to be reading some folks from the chat. I see, I'm Saul Zalchgender Gendler. My apologies. I know I mispronounced that. Notes that there are, this is a really interesting example where we see that the oral tradition about what happened had two different versions and and that the Talmud preserves both of them, right? So there are two different versions of what happened in this story. And unlike perhaps when we're sort of passing on, this is not the same, but like when we're passing on gossip, you sort of pick which version you think is most realistic. The Talmud it says, we actually think both of these are worth passing on. And that's interesting because Uriel in the chat just noted that Rav Nachman is known for insults. And so the second story is probably true. I would say, I don't know that Rav Nachman is specifically known for insults. There are rabbis who are known for being particularly ungracious sometimes or not having the kinds of tact we would expect. He is, however, known for having a strong sense of his own self-worth, which is different from attacking other people. So there, from a historical perspective, I can understand why someone would say it sounds like the second story is the true one, or it sounds like the first story is the true one, because we know that rabbis cared a lot about seniority and hierarchy. But the Talmud doesn't do that, right? The Talmud doesn't say one of them is right and one of them is wrong. It gives us both of these cases. And that is a really interesting version of, strategy that the Talmud is showing. And I think Robert Starr in the chat wrote, there's just a power struggle in refractors, right? They can't decide. Or they decide it's not their place to decide. It's their place to transmit. It's their place to transmit what is what they have received, right? That maybe they're not they're not in the business right now of judging. They're in the business of transmitting. I don't know whether that's always the case, but perhaps here. Carol, yes, can we unmute Carol?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Dr. Ronis. This is really fascinating. So I just have one idea. I have no idea if it has any merit, but maybe the Talmud editors let the two versions stand because they reflected different ways of practice in the communities. And by validating, if you will, different practices, by letting the two authorities' opinions stand, it was a way of keeping people more interested and more cognizant of the authorities. So in a way, even though it seems like a disagreement, it may have been a larger umbrella or tent to bring more people into the rabbinic authority than if they had just eliminated the other way of doing things. Just one thought. Thank you.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Carol. Now, what's interesting is we actually, as the story continues, we get a one clear version of what the ruling is. But I think part of what you're noting is that we're preserving a multiplicity of ways of engaging with maybe with our teachers. It's a great, we're seeing multiple ways of thinking about ourselves, right? So, oh, if I get corrected by someone more senior, does that mean that I must be wrong? Or if I get corrected by someone who is older than me, does that actually not matter because I know more about this particular topic than them? Right. So sort of ways of I think we're preserving a multiplicity of ways of relating to each other, and that all exist within the rabbinic framework. So I think all of those are certainly really there's this rich multiplicity here. Absolutely. I'll also just note, I'm seeing a lot of things in the chat now. Lynn Brodsky notes that teaching a way of thinking of analysis, not just the ruling, right? We don't just get the ruling, we get the ways that they were thinking and how we got there, and then offers this fantastic parallel. It's like math problems. If you don't show your work, the final example carries less weight. And I will say, as someone who's going to spend the rest of my day here grading final exams, I completely agree with you, Lynn, right? That showing thinking is really important. So I want to, they are not math exams, Lynn. They are exams in theology and Jewish studies. But I do think that we get this sort of fascinating exchange. And I think it's fair to say, and Rabbi Batsum notes that given what we know about Rev Nachman, the second possibility, the second version is at least consistent with some of the other ways that he depicts himself. But I don't want to end the story there because the story doesn't end there. And so I want to skip down, right? I brought you the Rav Nachman piece. And now let's look at the last piece of this story that I'm going to bring you. Rav Nachman retracted his words and then said the opposite. Eventually, Rav Nachman says, oh, you know what? I actually think I was wrong. Even if he states his condition at the time of giving the money, he has not acquired anything, right? Actually, the minute the money is exchanged, you can't add more conditions, right? Sorry, right? He goes from saying, yeah, you can absolutely add retroactive conditions to no, the minute the money has handed over, even if it's 10 seconds later, you cannot add more conditions. So I think that that's sort of where this story stopped in what we read in the newsletter. And it's really fascinating because here he got corrected. He starts out being almost like defensively saying no. And then you might think at some point he sort of sits and says, oh, actually, I think Rav Yehuda was right. I think Rav Yehuda was right. But that's not what happens. And that's what's particularly interesting, because if we keep reading, he tells us why he's changed his mind. And it's not Rav Yehuda at all. Rav Nachman said, this is part of a conversation he's having with Rabba about why he changed his mind. I used to say that a transaction with asmachta affects acquisition. Asmachta, for those of us who are, I mean, quite frankly, for all of us, everyone can always use explaining random Aramaic words. An asmachta is an obligation that, right? So there's what the law requires. You can agree to a financial disadvantage. You can, right? So you can intend, agree with full cognition and, et cetera. You can take on an additional financial disadvantage. Right, so an asmachta is an additional financial disadvantage. He used to say a transaction with asmachta affects acquisition. Right, even if you add an additional disadvantage, you can sign a contract knowing that you're at a financial disadvantage, right? You are an adult, you can make your own decisions, and those decisions can involve you being financially disadvantaged. But then, Yomi said that an asmachta does not affect acquisition. Now, cool. There are, just like with Rav Nachman, there are actually two Yomis in the Talmud. Two Rav Yomis in the Talmud. There's Rav Yomi bar Chilkia and Rav Yomi Breda Rav Nechumi. Neither of those, just for context, nope, I lost it. Neither of those, it doesn't tell us which of those it is. But what matters here is that both Yumis, right, which is why it doesn't really matter which one it is, both Yumis are third generation. Which means both Yumis are his peers. Right? So Rav Yehuda, who apparently is not why he changed his mind, is his senior. And both Yomis are his peers, right? So he's not learning it from a supervisor, he's learning it from a colleague. And Yomi says, no, if you take on, even knowingly, additional financial disadvantages, that doesn't, you can't affect acquisition that way. You don't get to, right? Like, it's just bad for the economy if people are doing that. Now, what's particularly striking to me about this part of the story is I want to highlight two things. First, Yumi never gives us an explanation. He just says, no, you can't do this. And apparently Rav Nachman says, oh, okay. And two, that the fact that it's a peer, right, is a very different thing. This isn't Rav Nachman being egotistical and saying, oh, nobody knows more than me. Or I don't care if people are more senior, right? They're just throwing a tantrum. This is Rav Nachman listening to a peer and saying, oh, you know things about this, and I am going to change my mind based on your telling me this. And here, Betsy has noted, and I think this is exactly the point we want to end on, or at least that I was hoping we would end on, which is that in peer generations, some opinions carry more weight than others. And we can think about this in the context of a work environment. And I know that the rabbis weren't a corporate structure, but, go with me here. Right, which is to say that sometimes people who are more senior maybe were raised in a different environment, maybe had different cultural expectations, have a different amount of experience, but maybe it can be harder for them to explain their reasoning or explain why, right? It's all so much in your head from your lived experience that it can be really hard to let somebody new into the thought process. I mean, I'm now at a stage of my career where I'm noticing that it can be hard to explain to someone who's new why we do things a certain way. So, there's that piece. And sometimes it does take a peer to say, no, that's not how we do it. If you say, oh, you're at the same stage as me, you understand what we're doing. If you're going to tell me this doesn't work, I know you have the same sort of expectations around thought processes and ruling and economics, so I'm going to trust it. And so I really do think what we're getting here is this very rich, fascinating story. Even with both versions of what happens, we're getting this really interesting case. Because in the first two stories, it's only about that one situation. Whether Rav Nachman agrees, oh, there must have been a flaw in this particular contract that Rav Yehuda threw it out, or he says, no, I'm not changing my mind at all, right? In both of those situations, we have Rav Nachman not actually changing his mind about the ruling. He just says, maybe in this one situation, I was wrong. What makes him change his mind about the situation at all, right, said, oh, actually, you cannot give retroactive conditions, is a conversation he has with his peer. And I think, to me, it just is a reminder that we learn from everyone around us, that we're learning from our teachers, we're learning from our peers, as we've seen in a number of other situations. We learn as well from our students. And again, I see a couple of folks when I said I was grading comment, oh, me too, good luck, right? We learn a lot from our students, but that learning comes from, is 360. And I think we get that really interesting sense here today. And I will note, because I have a soft spot for Rav Nachman, that I actually think that the end of the story complicates the idea that he's just being egotistical. I think the end of the story complicates that idea really powerfully and says, whatever was happening in that one story, we get a sense that he is really trying to learn what is the right thing to do in the case more generally. And he's learning that not only from superiors, but from his peers. So that is what I had for us today. A little more social context for that story, a little bit more of the story that you can do in 750 words. I hope we come away with a sense of excitement to learn from everyone around us. So thank you all. Have a wonderful morning, a wonderful afternoon, good night to those of you who are on other sides of the world, and I will see you again on our journey
Soon.
through the DAF.
Thank you so much, everyone. We'll be following up with a recording of this and with the source sheet. So if you came in late, not to worry. Okay, bye for now.